Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started. First of all, we want to welcome you to UCEA's 2016 Annual Convention. We trust that you have already begun to visit some sessions and network with friends, get to see folks you haven't seen in a long time, and we're really excited to have you here. My name is Wayne Lewis. I'm from the University of Kentucky, and I have the pleasure of serving as your MC this evening. We do want to begin by giving a special thank you to Texas A&M University for their sponsorship of this session. We can give them a hand. And we want to give an additional special thank you to Wayne State University for their sponsorship of ADA services during this session. Let's give them a hand as well. I want to invite to the podium a few folks to give us brief words of introduction. We will have brief words from President Monica Byrne-Jimenez from Hofstra University, Doug Whitman, Dean at Wayne State University, and Christy Cooper from Michigan State University, and Michelle Young, our UCEA Executive Director. Would those folks please come?
Buenas noches y bienvenidos a Detroit. Detroit, we all know of it as the Motor City. For obvious reasons, but I did a few searches online because that's what we academics do, we Google. And I found that it's also called the City of Design, that builds on its past as a model modern city. It's also known as a City of Hope, building on the resilience of its people and its communities. And so as you go out and continue to enjoy each other's company, learn from each other, and build our community of scholars in this space, I want you to keep in mind the City of Hope. We also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the indigenous lands on which we are gathering and the first people who were displaced from their homelands as a result of colonization. The Detroit area was originally inhabited by the Anish-Anabeg, also called the people of the Three Fires, the Chippewa, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa nations. The 2014 census calculates that the American Indian population of Michigan to be over 59,000, or roughly 1%, which makes it the 10th largest population of Native Americans in the United States. So we just want to express our gratitude and that we have the opportunity to share and learn from one another in this space that has for time immemorial been designated as a location where people of differing backgrounds and ideologies would come together to barter, trade, and engage in lively conversation, thus collapsing borders, growing in deeper understanding about one another, and in the process of hope. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to give a little bit of a different welcome, although I'm lucky I got here. It's my city, and on the way I had my notes next to me, and I had an Aleppo moment and drove to Cobo Hall. It's about 10 minutes walking from here. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to Detroit, to Wayne State University, and to welcome you for the College of Education. The theme, Revitalizing Education in Complex Contexts, Re-envisioning Leadership, Refreshing Practice, and Refining Student Success, is certainly relevant today. And I don't think anyone in America's schools or educators would disagree that we're living in very challenging and complex times to get that done, particularly in the next 4 years when we don't even know if there'll be a U.S. Department of Education at the end of that time. For you, this is a great opportunity to meet new colleagues, to gather, talk, and plan to address those challenges in policy and research and leadership over the next couple of years. And I hope that you form some new collaborations, partnerships, and friends so that you can develop some innovative directions during this business meeting. I want to thank the organizers for their wisdom in bringing the meeting to Detroit this year. And you're welcome back in a year. For those of you who have not been to Detroit or have not been to Detroit recently, you're probably having an awakening if you move around Detroit or around Maine State University. Detroit has moved from being a city of urban troubles to its own awakening. We've moved from a city where photographers from around the country came to capture the strange beauty of skeletal remains of buildings. And now if you look around, what you'll see is new construction, new businesses, new growth. We are a city growing where young people now come to because they want to live here. It's becoming a city of artists and entrepreneurs. We are still a city of music and sports. We're still Motown, and we're still the Motor City. Though if some of you get an opportunity to go up Woodward, you'll notice that there are these metal things in the road. They're called rails, and we're trying out this new thing called trains. We're going to do it up through Woodward first because we're not sure if public mass transit really is just a fad. But I think many of us are hoping we just continue those rails right out to further distances. Just some trivia for those who've not been here before. It's the only place in the country where you can look south to Canada. And right now, you're all sitting, admittedly pretty high up, but sitting over one of the largest salt mines in the world. Underneath you is over 100 miles of roads in a salt mine, which leaves no explanation for why last winter we ran out of salt for the roads. What I'd like you to do while you're here, because I know that fundamentally you're all here to work and to talk and to attend meetings and work and then complain about how much work you did when you get back. But if you could just take one break, visit Greektown, visit Corktown, visit Mexican Town, visit Eastern Market, one of my favorite places, particularly on Saturday when you've got an immense number of vendors and interesting shops to see. And then also you might want to take in, amidst all the other work you're doing, the Detroit Institute of Arts. This is one of the premier art institutes in the country, competing with MoMA and the Getty, or the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, or the Detroit Science Center. And if you get down there and visit those places, walk across Woodward Avenue, that university you didn't expect to see there, particularly if you haven't seen it in a while or never, is Wayne State University. It is an extraordinarily, for you who might have seen it 20 years ago, you will not believe what the university looks like now. It is an amazing university. I was going to call it a great university, but I decided I would never again use the term great again. Finally, let me just say, because I want to get back to your work, we have some wonderful, classy, high-quality restaurants in the city of Detroit. We're a great place to eat. But any city in the country has fancy, overpriced restaurants with excellent food served in small quantities, aesthetically laid out like appetizers on a too large plate. Don't pay all that money for that. Think of this. This city, you know, was in trouble. It had been devastated before. We faced bankruptcy. Now we are emerging. But how did we survive those decades here? There's one thing that let Detroiters survive those decades: comfort food. So don't waste your time on the other. Comfort food. We are the largest consumer of potato chips in the country. Try some Verner's ginger ale. It's the oldest commercial ginger ale in the country. It actually uses real ginger. Get a Coney dog. I know there's rumors that the Coney dog was invented somewhere like Fort Wayne, somewhere south of here. But Detroit perfected the Coney dog. Go to a Coney Island and get a Coney dog totally smothered with chili and onions and relish and cheese. They will smother it so much that you can only just see little bits of the tails of the dog peeking out at the end of the bun, and you will have to eat it with a knife and fork because of the way it is. Isn't that right? I can see you nodding. If that sounds too pedestrian for you, we have a fantastic public library. You could go there with a sandwich, but why don't you go instead to a pie-brary? You know, Bon Appetit magazine said that going to the pie-brary, Ludwinski's on Kercheval Street, is alone worth the trip to Detroit. You can go there on Kercheval Street, so take a taxi, and you can get wonderful sandwiches and coffee, and then you can have dessert. It's a pie-brary, so you can choose yours, but my favorite would be a slice of salted maple, creamy custard pie and a twice-baked, all-butter, crazy flaky shell. That's just to give you an example of the kinds of pies there. And then finally, my favorite place is Slo's Barbecue on Michigan Avenue. Slo's Barbecue, I believe, has the best barbecued anything in the country, and it has mac and cheese to die for. So go to Slo's and get something barbecued and mac and cheese. So when you go back and complain about how hard it was, and you've gone to these places, you will understand when you've experienced this comfort food that will be enough when you have to explain to your spouse, your partner, your lover, and your colleagues why you work so hard yet gain 10 pounds. So again, that's my introduction to Detroit. Welcome. We're pleased to have you here, and come back anytime. Thank you.
Good evening. On behalf of Michigan State University, I'd like to welcome you to the 30th UCEA Convention, the City of Detroit, and the State of Michigan. As a land-grant institution, Michigan State University strongly values scholarship and programming that serve the people of our state. As such, MSU as a whole takes an active role in contributing to the revitalization of Detroit on many fronts. In our own humble department of K-12 Educational Administration, we offer our principal preparation program courses here and a satellite campus at the MSU Detroit Center in downtown Detroit. And in preparing aspiring school leaders in Detroit, we're struck by their commitment, passion, and persistence, and how they bring these elements to their work and their studies in this challenging and complex educational context. As the city and its schools face reorganization and an unfair amount of inner turbulence, school leaders in Detroit are critical players in serving and protecting the teachers and students in their schools. The faculty at MSU would like to dedicate our sponsorship of this year's UCEA convention to our master's certification pathway, EDD, and PhD students who live and work in and around the city of Detroit. We know that our relationships and partnerships with our Detroit-based students are how we as scholars are most likely to contribute to the enhanced educational opportunities and experiences of children and youth in this city. And we recognize that the practical hardships and hard-earned victories that our Detroit students share with us help us to develop teaching and scholarship that reflect the realities of life in a city that is working and often struggling to re-envision, refresh, and redefine itself and its people. As Tonya Allen speaks tonight, we at MSU encourage you to think about the educational leaders in the city of Detroit. Those who are just beginning to lead, those who have persisted in their leadership for many years, and all those in between. We ask you to consider the daily challenges and complexities of their critical leadership work during these important times. As you hear from Tonya Allen about reform efforts in the city, neighborhoods, schools, and classrooms of Detroit, know that those of us who teach at MSU draw on your research in educational administration to guide the learning experiences of our leadership students in Detroit. We hope that tonight's presentation and all the interactions you'll have over the next few days here at the convention will inspire you to continue to engage in meaningful, impactful scholarship that we can then draw on to help the city and educators of Detroit continue to push forward and enhance the lives of children and youth in the city's schools. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy. Well, on behalf of UCEA, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2016 convention. And after Doug's introduction and welcome to us, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a little hungry. That sounded just absolutely wonderful. Our excellent planning committee this year, led by April Peters, the new UCEA president, has put together a program that emphasizes the challenges that higher education and K-12 educators face, that we face as we're trying to prepare leaders, as we're trying to prepare teachers, as we're trying to engage in school reform, as we're trying to ensure that the schools that we develop for children are serving their emotional needs as well as their educational needs. And these are obviously difficult, very, very difficult challenges that we face. But it's individuals like those of you who are here at UCEA that help us develop knowledge and skills and practices and strategies to be able to address those different challenges. So I do hope that you find over the next few days some inspirations, some great ideas, and some terrific colleagues that you didn't have before you came here. I'd like for you to join me in thanking our planning team for this year, which includes Dana Thompson-Dorsey. Where are you, Dana? I'm not sure where she is. Wayne Lewis. Christy Cooper, who just introduced for Wayne's sake, for their efforts. It's an excellent program, which was kicked off earlier today by a phenomenal, I'll use Michael Dantley's word, phenomenal awards luncheon, during which we honored significant contributions from Pamela Tucker, Michael Dantley, Terrence Green, Carol Mullen, Ann Ishimaru, Beth Eisman, Cynthia Carver, and the University of Washington Leadership for Learning program. Over the next few days, I hope you get an opportunity to tell them congratulations for that and learn more about some of the excellent work that they're doing to improve this profession. I also hope that you leave with much more than you arrived here in Detroit, because in addition to possibly gaining 10 pounds, we have some really interesting and fun things in store for you all. If you have not done so, you might want to think about registering, for example, for the Jackson Scholars Flash Mob. What is the flash mob, you ask? Well, it just so happens that this is the town, this is the home of Motown, which you didn't mention. And if you like music, and you like to dance, and you like the element of surprise, and you would like to sponsor the Jackson Scholars program for a low cost of $15, you can participate in a flash mob, and it'll be wonderful. UCA awesome, actually. All you have to do is visit our staff at the UCEA headquarters. So before closing, I also wanted to give a shout out to our convention sponsors this year. In addition to Wayne State University and Michigan State University, we are fortunate to have the support of the Wallace Foundation, Penn State University, Texas A&M, the University of Houston, the Brock International Prize, Chapman University, the University of Louisville. And if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to have the really terrific speakers, the interpreter services for our individuals with hearing impairments, and some of the wonderful receptions that we're able to offer you all. We sincerely appreciate their contributions to UCEA and what they're able to, for to enable us to do for you all. With that, I just want to wish you all a very wonderful convention. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, Detroit's challenges have been chronicled. What is less widely known, though, is something that Dean Whitman shared, and that is that something really special is happening in Detroit. And for that reason, we were incredibly excited that Tonya Allen accepted our invitation to be our keynote speaker, because Tonya is a part of that something special that is happening in Detroit. A serial ideapreneur, she serves as the Skillman Foundation's president and chief executive officer. Her career has centered on pursuing excellence and investing in ideas that improve her hometown of Detroit and reduce the plight of underserved people, especially children. Allen has been instrumental in many successful philanthropic, government, and community initiatives, and has a comprehensive understanding of philanthropic governance and strategy. In her current role, she aligns the complexities of education reform, urban revitalization, and public policy to improve the well-being of Detroit's children. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Ms. Tonya Allen.
Well, welcome to Detroit. So if you were from Detroit, I want to just say that Doug and Christy did a great job welcoming you here, but as a person who's a native of Detroit, if you come to Detroit and you know somebody is from Detroit, what you say is, "What up, though?" So, what up, though? What up, though? You say it back. So it's so good to see you guys. I also just wanted to thank you all for having me today, and am really excited to talk to you about what's happening in Detroit and what I think the Detroit context means for national education reform, but also to walk you through the complexity that we are faced here. But before I do that, I wanted to just say a couple things to you. First, I just want you to know that the weather outside in Detroit is beautiful. And I hope that you do get outside and enjoy it. I actually ordered it for you. And if you don't, so there's this saying about black girl magic, and this literally, I did use black girl magic to help you guys get this great weather. It won't last long. And then the second thing I want to say to you is that you might not like my speech. You might not like anything I say, so what I like to do is load the deck in my favor. So I want you to start tweeting something about me that's really good. Like, you can tweet me at Allen_Tonya and say, like, she's so fly. I wish anything you want to say, that she's cute. I'm happy with any of those things if you don't like the content of it. But I hope, though, seriously, that I like social media because I think actually it allows us to not just send out information, but it is really, to me, about how do we communicate complex ideas together and talk about them, not just the people in this room, but how do we expand that circle so that people really understand that what is happening in our community and that they understand and learn it. So let me get at it. So when I think about, thank you. When I think about education, and I thought about your topic of revitalizing education in complex contexts, I thought to myself, well, you came to the right place. Detroit is probably one of the most complex contexts in the country. Now, many of you are thinking, like, everybody says that. It really isn't that bad. Actually, it really is that bad, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about it. So the first thing I actually want to do is talk to you a little bit about the child population in Detroit. In 1999, and I tend to use like about 2000 as a 15-year window to give you a context of change. In 1999, there were about 340,000 school-age or children in the city of Detroit. In 2014, there is 170,000 children. They continue to tell me it's a 40% decrease, but my math tells me it's about 50%. Those numbers are a little old. So as you can see, we're talking about a very destabilized environment, and I think that's one of the first and most important things that I can share with you. In addition to that, when you hear about the recovery of Detroit, we are just at this year, in 2016, is the first time we have not lost population since 1950. So we're finally stabilizing. But the key to that stabilization, I would tell you this, is that it's not that we are not continuing to lose children, because children and families are still leaving Detroit, despite the fact that we have lots of young professionals who are moving into it. So the decline that is happening around our education system is going to continue. Now, when you talk about Detroit, there is often, and you'll hear a lot about this notion of Detroit is recovering, Detroit is the comeback city. You hear a lot of that. And also the other thing that you hear about it is that there are two Detroits. And they talk about like a new Detroit and an old Detroit. And the new Detroit, really what they're talking about are many of the young professionals and many of the corporations who are moving into Detroit, and they really see Detroit as a land of opportunity. The prices are low, the land is vast, and there are lots of opportunities to kind of disrupt current systems so you can innovate and create opportunities for yourself that you probably would not be able to create in other cities. Now, this old Detroit, which I don't like that frame because they're not necessarily old, it's, they're not seasoned either. It's really that they are more like a legacy class. So these are folks who have been in this city for a really long time. They've held the city together. And even though they've been here, they've been the one paying taxes, they've been the ones who have cut the grass when the city would not do it, there's a level of disrespect that tends to happen to that population of folks here, as if they did this to the city and not the nearly 1 million people who have left this city over the last 20 years. They actually did they created what happened to Detroit, not the people who have remained here. And so those folks, as you can imagine, are not really that happy about all of this energy that is happening in the downtown and the midtown area. And it's not that they don't want it to happen, they want it to happen for them too. So you end up having this very vibrant core that's beginning to emerge out of Detroit. And I don't take that core for granted, to be honest, because that is a core that, in my opinion, is still fragile, and we still have to invest in it and strengthen it. But they look at that core and they are not happy because they don't see that same level of investment in neighborhoods with them. But I like to offer up a different view on Detroit, that I actually think that there are far more than two Detroits, just like any community. But I would say that there is a third population in Detroit that is very different from that first, of those who are forward-looking, seeing the possibilities in our city, that legacy class who are seeing what they've lost, and they still feel the pain of what they do not have anymore. And that third class, in my opinion, are young people who don't see a future or a past. They only see today. And what they see today is that we are not investing in them and that there are no opportunities for them. And I often think about the kinds of violence that you see that is coming out of urban cores, especially like places like Chicago. I'm like, that's a third Chicago. And we are, quite honestly, as a city, in my opinion, at risk of having uprisings come out of our city unless we really begin to deal with these inequities that exist across the board. So this chart here really gives you and shows you what's happening in this third Detroit. So in terms of children in poverty, in 1999, 35% of the kids in the city of Detroit, so I'm not actually reading off that chart, I'm going to come to it in a second. In 1999, 35% of the kids in Detroit were poor. And at that time, we were one of the poorest big cities in the country. And today, we're almost 60% poor. our children. So we're about 56%, 57% of children who are poor in our community. Now, that is one of the highest percentages in the country. It's actually, if you go to rural Mississippi, we're equivalent, to give you context. Now, this chart here shows you a concentrated poverty. So even if you tend to be in the 40% or so of families who are not poor, you're still likely to live in a poor neighborhood. And we all know what the research says about that. If you live in a poor place, you're more likely, regardless of your parents' income, to have the same kind of outcomes that children who are poor will have. And so this is basically the context in which we're working. And I'm raising this question about context, particularly because I think in education reform, what ends up happening is that people focus on content first. What do we do in the school building? What's the idea that we want to execute? Here is the strategy, here is how we're focusing, here is the data that we're going to construct, that we're going to put in a school building, and this will fix education. Well, content without context is not going to be effective. It does not work. You have to marry both content and context together to be successful. And if you don't believe me, let me show you a little bit about what this means. So here I'm showing you how Detroit fares when we take a straight content look. So we have in Detroit right now probably the most diverse set of reforms. All of the ideological reforms you can imagine around education land in Detroit. And that's the quality of education that we're providing to our children. So we have more school choice. We are the second largest city, or the largest per capita place that has school choice in the country, yet we don't have any, we actually have had less access to high quality schools than we've ever had before. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the ecosystem. Now, I know you can't read that chart, but what I actually want you to do is to kind of look at the scale of this chart, and so I can give you some insight about it. There are approximately about 125 school-aged children in the city of Detroit. About 47,000 of them go to Detroit Public Schools, 5,000 are in Education Achievement Authority, which is basically a state school recovery district like New Orleans. We have about 35,000 kids who are in Detroit-based charters, another 14,000 who are in suburban charters. So that gives you about 50,000 kids who are in charter schools. So when you look at those two numbers in Detroit proper, we're literally about half and half traditional public schools and half choice options. Then we have another 11,000 students who go to school in traditional suburban districts. So, and these numbers, let me just tell you, don't include a couple of things. They don't tell us the students who use a different address to go to schools in neighborhoods in these suburban districts who will not accept them if they're from Detroit. The second is, it doesn't tell us the numbers of students who are in private schools. And the third thing is, it doesn't tell us the number of kids who have either been pushed out or who drop out of school. And what they do tell us, though, is that about 25,000 children leave the city of Detroit to go to school every single day. And if you were to put that in a state context, that would make those 25,000 kids would be the third largest district in the state of Michigan. Just to give you some scale and thought about what that looks like. We have 195,000 buildings that serve about 88,000 kids. In 1999, going back that 15-year frame, we had a little over 180,000 students in 263 buildings. So you can tell, here I'm telling you that our population as a city has pretty much decreased between 40 and 50% per children, but yet our school buildings have only decreased by 25. Now, you're going to say, just close some schools, and I'm going to talk to you about that. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of insight about what's going on in Detroit public schools during this time period. So basically, our school system has declined pretty significantly. And so what you'll see in this chart is really how students are distributed across various school systems. So the green is Detroit Public Schools. So if you look at 2005, where you have a little more than 100,000, almost 125,000 students, and then you go 10 years later, and you are now below 50,000 students. So you're a third of the size you were in 10 years, all right? So basically what we're seeing is that you have a public school system that has been eroded. So all of the big levers, and then I will get into this a little bit more, but all of the big levers that have influenced this district's decline and demise have really been based on a set of state public policies. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. So one of the things I would say is that Michigan is the second oldest charter law in the country. We have never reformed that law except one time in 2010 when we decided to take the charter cap off, even though we were not confident that there was strong performance there. So between a 3-year period of 2010 and 2013 in Detroit, 32 new schools opened. Now remember, Detroit was the second largest population loss in the country from a city. We trailed New Orleans, and New Orleans had a natural catastrophe. We had a man-made one, but the drop was just as significant. And then in 2011, our state decided that they were going to create a state recovery district modeled after New Orleans, right? Now that state recovery district started off with 10,000 kids, and by the end of it, they're now at 5,000 kids, 50%. So it just gives you a little bit of context around that. And then the last thing that I think would be helpful for you to understand is that this district, while it was going through its most difficult time, was actually being led predominantly by the state. So if you look at the last 15 years, 10 of those years has been led by a state-appointed leader. Now, if any of us were running a business, we would never survive. You cannot survive under this particular context. And so many people would say, well, Detroit, just close the buildings, cut your expenses. And so one of the things that I actually like to show is that Detroit actually did do that. I mean, so if you look at that, they pretty much have been trying to cut as they were going every single year. But imagine trying to make these cuts while with your revenues going down fast, knowing that you have pretty significant fixed costs that you cannot adjust. At the same time, this whole narrative, and you know, Detroit is the butt of every joke around education across the country. When you want to talk about bad schools, you talk about Detroit, right? And so one of the things that's interesting to me about that is that Detroit has been held accountable for these schools when they haven't had responsibility for them. So I want to then just say, the last thing I would say about this is that since 1999, there have been 5 different state emergency managers running Detroit public schools. So think about the most fragile business you possibly could have, and then you're going to transition leaders every 18 months, and those leaders are going to start brand new because they're not working off of each plan. They act, even though they're state emergency managers, and none of them had education experience, they all were acting as if they were a superintendent. And you know how superintendents, everything before you doesn't count. So that was exactly what was happening. And so the other thing I would say is since 2009, the only emphasis has been on this district's finances and none on its academics. So all of this is happening, and basically no one is in charge. There are 14 different entities, and I'm going to come back to this point, that can open and close schools in Detroit. So our supply and our demand is out of whack. The numbers of seats that you see vary substantially by neighborhoods. Oh, it's so funny. This is actually, the slides are showing up different. I'm like, yellow, there's no yellow on there. So if you actually look at those dark gray spaces on this map of Detroit, those are places where you have too much capacity, so too much supply. And then in the red is where you have more demand than you do supply. So you can see there is not a place in the city where you actually have a balanced approach, the right number of schools that should be there. And I told you that we decreased building supply by 25%, while we see student population almost 50%. But here's the caveat in that. This is saying school buildings, but in actuality, what we've done with charter schools is that we actually don't open charter schools in traditional public schools. So we've converted school buildings that used to be formerly religious schools. We've also converted office buildings. Any empty building we could find, charter schools would convert those into buildings. So what we're really talking about is that the supply, we've increased the supply at the same time that we needed to decrease it, that there's this kind of additional currency that's on that. And then I would say this, over the last 15 years, what we've seen is that 230 school buildings in Detroit have either been closed or reconfigured. Let me say that number again. 230 school buildings have either been closed or reconfigured, and more than 100 have been started or converted from the traditional district to charter or to EAA. Imagine the disruption. Thank you. Imagine the disruption that is happening in this place around education. It's baffling to me. All right, now, not in addition to there's nobody in charge, we're being inefficient. So the ideal utilization rate in any school district, or not even ideal, it's actually the lowest utilization rate that any district would want to use is 80%. There's not a region in the city of Detroit that even gets close to 80%. There's one region that gets to 70%. So basically what you have is 20,000 extra seats, extra capacity that we are paying for and spreading across at the cost of investing deeply in the children who are in our system. In addition to that, when you have this much inefficiency in your system, what you create is this hyper-competitive environment where everyone is marketing aggressively to make sure that students are in seats in their school buildings. So, and you don't just have that happening inside of the city, you also have that happening outside of the city where those 25,000 kids are going, and by the way, our suburbs and the rest of the state have lost student population too. So they're trying to figure out how they keep their capacity going and sustain their fixed costs, and by inviting new students in their district. So the focus is not on quality, rather the focus again is on finances. So you see this is even further exacerbated when charters, public charters in Michigan don't receive any public funding for facilities. So they have to take that out of their student aid that they get for each individual student. And they're paying over market because they can't get into existing buildings. I just want you to understand that what we're doing is a little baffling to me. Because not only is it inefficiency in facilities, now what we're doing is distributing inefficiency at almost every level we possibly can have. So I'm bringing this chart back up because you've seen it again. You saw it before. So now you have 14, I told you we have 14 different entities that are opening and closing schools. Each of them have an authorizing office. They all take 3% from the school. So every single one of them has to have a superintendent. They have to have people who are going to look after the schools. Each of these charter management companies have superintendents there. You know, they have facility people. So you end up seeing how we're layering on more and more bureaucracy into these buildings. And all of that bureaucracy is at a cost to children. And so it means that there are really no extra supports that are provided to students. Now, I can't take you all the way back to the slides, but remember the poverty levels that I told you exist in the city of Detroit. So the kids who are the most fragile, who need the most supports, are in the most destabilized environment with the less support they possibly can have. Most of us in this room could tell you what our third grade teacher was. And most of us could say, I had Miss Jackson in third grade, and my brother had Miss Jackson in third grade. These kids can tell you they had Miss Jackson, they can tell you that they had Miss Ramirez, and they can tell you they had Miss Lewinsky in third grade, because that's the kind of cycling that is happening in these schools at both the city, at the charter level, as well as the district level. And it shows. This is a scatter chart. Obviously, you guys know that. But you see, to the far right, that line is probably where you want a school to be at. And you see, in general, this dashed line is pretty much about where the city average is. DPS average, charter average is about the same. We're underperforming. I showed you the chart on how we're looking at NAEP. So charters and traditional schools are performing at the worst in the country. And what people don't really understand is that it isn't just these schools. Detroit is the canary in the mine for our state, because our state is only performing slightly above what the average urban district is doing, right? So we got a long way to go. And I think that partly, in my mind, what we have to do is really figure out how we support schools. We got to figure out how we right-size this ecosystem. We got to have a landscape of high-quality schools across the board. We have to have standards and accountability that forces schools to close if they're not bringing value into the region, but it has to be done in the context of what is happening in the community and what's happening in the city. We need to bring in world-class educators, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later. Not just bring them in, but develop them, because Detroit has a lot of educators here who have gone through this transition of 15 years. And I often say, if I was at a place like that, if I worked at not a place as in Detroit schools or any environment like that, I would have quit a long time ago. And I would have moved, because nobody wants that kind of environment where you're working. But essentially, you have teachers who are either overcommitted and they're the best you can possibly have, and they're going to serve children at whatever cost they possibly can. Or you have teachers who are basically, who will never leave because this is really not their calling. They're waiting on their retirement. So you have two classes of teachers that are falling there. And then you have some teachers who have come into these districts for moral reasons, trying to help and support the schools without any support at all in general, because of the declining economic situation that we've seen. And what we're seeing in Detroit is there are very few people. We talk about schools, we talk about policy, but we very rarely talk about children. We very rarely talk about what kids need. And one of the things we know, especially because of the state that many of their families are in economically, that we got to figure out how to invest deeply in early childhood. And we got to figure out how we build a citywide youth development and enrichment opportunities. Detroit is one of the few cities that actually does not have a stabilized youth opportunities investment. We have no fund that would support that. And then we need the social and emotional. Many of you have heard the stories about Detroit's blight. And you may even go and take a look at it. Some people call it blight porn, because people are fascinated by the blight that exists in this city and the amount of vacancy that is here in these communities. Now put that in the context of a child's life. You're walking past it. You're afraid every single day. You basically are experiencing trauma. You are highly activated, and there are no supports in your school to support that. And then we have to make sure. Now these kids, despite all of these challenges, I have to tell you, these kids are resilient. When we send kids to college, regardless if they are fully ready or not, they stick it out. Like we actually have found that many of the schools that we've supported, they might take them 6 years or 7 years, but they are graduate. Not all of them, but many of them, and we're beating, actually, in some cases, national averages around that, because these young people, despite their challenges, they're building the kind of resiliency you need to be successful when you can face those and still come out and be ready and interested in going to college. Now, I put this up because one of the things that I've been working on for the last 2 years is an effort called the Coalition for the Future of Detroit Schoolchildren. And the reason that we put this coalition together is because of all of the things that I told you. Now, you know more than probably 80% of the legislators in Michigan. And you probably know more than most of the parents in Detroit, because you can't even imagine. Remember, I told you most of this happened over a 15-year period. And you see the most rapid decline happening over the last 4 or 5 years. You can't even imagine how you would stay abreast of this and understand what was going on in the city. So we put together this coalition that was cross-representation of race, gender, sectoral representation from business to parents to teachers to principals to community leaders, across the board, politicians, et cetera. And then we also put together a coalition that had cross-representation from political parties. So we knew that we needed to have strong Democrats and strong Republicans because we had a Republican-led legislature. And then what we also knew was that if we were to continue to allow our agency to be taken away from us, because almost every school system in the city of Detroit was being led by a state entity, that we would never get changes that we needed to see in this city. After about 2 years of fighting, and I mean like literally, it felt like we went to the 11th round, and we actually did. We were able to garner about $700 million from the state for Detroit public schools. And those dollars were used to actually reduce the debt and to basically do a managed bankruptcy for our district. And it is a great success in some ways because we were able to get double the money that the state actually gave to the city for bankruptcy. There were a lot of things that we were not able to move. We couldn't move a same standard, and with forced closures for both traditional and charters. We could not create an entity that we thought where there was one entity, we called it the Detroit Education Commission, that was over all schools, regardless if they were traditional public, charter, or schools in the EAA. But we were able to close the state district and to have those students merge back into the traditional district. And we were able to create local leadership and ownership by reinstating a school board in Detroit. Now, as I look at this and we talk about a comeback city for Detroit, that comeback is fragile. If we don't figure out how we create and prepare a student population, then we will not really benefit from the kind of economic leverage that we need to have in our community, and the economic benefits and impact that we know if we have young people who are more engaged in it. Now, I want to spend just the last 10 minutes of this presentation talking to you a little bit about what I believe the lessons are around this work. And the first I would say is this, is that this environment that we've created allows families to struggle. We've essentially created a predatory enrollment strategy, instability of schools in the school landscape, and parents who don't have real voice to shape and impact their schools. I often describe this as kind of like Hunger Games. This is Hunger Games for families. It is Hunger Games for them to choose schools. Most of us think that school choice is the best option, and I'm a choice proponent. But when you have so many choices, it's almost like your 401k. If you don't have any architecture to help you make choices, you actually opt out of making a choice. That's what our human psychology allows us to do. The second is that Detroit, in my mind, is I talked about this, the canary in the coal mine, not just for the state. It can be the canary in the coal mine for the country. If we are not thinking about context and content at the same time, if we're only focusing on solutions that are ideologically driven and not practically sound. And that would be one of the biggest things that I would say. The other thing I would say is this, is that we need to change our narrative and our language. We often talk about these schools, or we talk about how children aren't performing. Let me be clear, in Detroit, let me be clear. Detroit schools are broken, not as people and not as children. And we need to make sure that we change that narrative. The other thing that I would offer to you, because I think it's an important one, that we spend very little time. Now, I represent a philanthropic organization. I understand how you can have organizations like mine have undue influence on systems that affect people, and I have no accountability in that. Now, I try to have an accountability because I live here, I've grown up here, and I know the people here. But there are foundations, especially many national foundations, that come in who focus on the content and the solution. They create a mess, and they get to walk away. And we basically are allowing that to happen, not just in Detroit, but across the country. So the Broad Foundation helped create the Education Achievement Alliance. Helped create it. They no longer are funding in Detroit because it's too hard. The last couple of things I want to lift up is this. The diversity of leaders. If we really want to be in these places, the leaders who are helping this, the leaders who help people understand what's going in their places and to navigate these politics and to understand what their agency is, to understand what a vision is, has to be people that the community trusts. Now, whatever your community looks like, you should have some representation of that. And not just representation and just kind of like looking like them. Like, like, I'm black, you black, I represent you. Nah, not really. It doesn't work that way. I mean, like, we actually need to create an environment where we really are listening to people, that we hear their voices and that we don't discount them and disregard them because they can't say it eloquently and maybe their subject and verb don't agree. We have to figure out how we create opportunity for those people, not just to inform us, but we also need to create opportunity for them to help lead us. It is, my grandmother used to say, none of us is smarter than all of us. And I really believe that, and I believe it to this work, is that if we aren't creating a space for all of us to do this work, we can't do it well, and we will not be able to navigate our way out of this pathway. And then the last thing I would say is this, I think that reformers in general, people who do education work, they talk about education and they approach education like they're giving a lecture. They're really smart, they want to talk about it, they want to give the data, and I'm doing the same thing right now. But what I want to say is that education reform is a combat sport. You cannot, while you're sitting at a podium figuring out what's the most eloquent words you can say to describe what you want to describe, you got folks who are in the trenches who are not civil, who do not care what you think or what you say, who do not care if it's the right thing to do, who are fighting against you the entire time. And my point around that is that if we're going to do this work well, if you are going to help districts do this work well, we can't just bring research and theory to it. We can't just bring ideas and programs to it. We also have to bring courageous leadership. The kind of leadership that will say what is wrong when you know it's unpopular. The kind of leadership that will go in places that's going to be uncomfortable to them, where they may even be attacked. But it's the kind of leadership that being there steady and present and making sure that people are moving towards the same goal and bringing people along in conversations that are difficult and hard, and hearing information that you don't want to hear that fundamentally may go cut across or against your values. You got to do that. That's the work. That's how we do the work in a competitive and a challenging landscape. That's the work of how you manage context in this work. So we have a long way to go in Detroit. I hope I didn't depress you all. Because I'm not depressed. Actually, I'm very hopeful. I'm extraordinarily hopeful. The reason that I'm hopeful is because we know what our problems are in this city. And we have people who are ready to fight for us at every level, in every sector, across every political affiliation. People are ready to take this on. We had our school board elections here. We had 64 people sign up to be elected. Now, it was a hell of an election, you could imagine. How do you even decide between 64? But it tells you the number of people who said, we can do this and we can fix it. And so I'm extraordinarily hopeful that we will be able to get on the right path in Detroit, but I know it's not a quick path. It's not a short path. It's a long and it's a windy path. But it's the kind of path where you need courageous leaders to be walking you through it at the time, and leaders who don't walk away just because their jobs change, but leaders who are fully committed to the work. So that is what I would say about Detroit. I hope that you get to come out, and there are good things that happen in Detroit in education too. But I wanted to give you this broader context of how complex this work is and what we need to do, not just in Detroit, but what we must be doing in every community across this country if we're really going to push the needle and stop treading water on ed reform in our country. Thank you.
We want to thank Tonya for that message. Unfortunately, we are at time and we won't have the opportunity to do questions and answers, but we are incredibly thankful for you spending some time with us. I'll tell you personally that I am not depressed. I'm actually more inspired than ever to go home and continue to engage in this type of work in our community because our children's lives hang in the balance. So thank you. And we are now, I believe, going into our UCEA reception, which is right outside. So have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.